for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. My name is Darren Gibson. I am your co-host.
My name is Jack Prince, your fellow co-host.
Jack, we have got a lot to talk about today, as seems like we always do every time we get together. We got a lot of Trump news. We got Canadian truckers at the border trying to stop entry from the United States into Canada. The mayor of Windsor's had enough.
Hey,
that's right. There might be another trucker protest outside the Super Bowl. And we've got coronavirus news as well. So before we get into our topics today, a couple of reminders that you can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on Twitter at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. And you can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, or Reason.fm by doing a search for Southpaws. And once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and YouTube accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and KEPJ in San Antonio, Texas. So be sure to listen to us there as well. Before we get started, there's a new show that I am just starting. The first episode is going to come out next week on the 15th. It's going to be a monthly public affairs program. And the program is called, of course, is my catchphrase, period, end of story. And for our first episode, we talked last week about PFAS in biosolids and what happened to the Grostic farm over in Livingston County, Michigan. After we finished recording last week, Friday, Tony Spagnola, who is an attorney in Detroit, he's also the co-chair of the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. He finally got back with me because I was trying to get him on the show. We ended up doing a 40-minute talk over the phone on February 7th. And I've got a little clip here. This is actually not part of the show that's going out on the 15th. So here is a quick 30-second clip of what period end of story is going to be like. My understanding from the Detroit Metro Times article was that companies like Heinz and Del Monte will not buy any crops that are produced on farms that have used biosolids. Is that what you've been made aware of too?
I'm not aware of that, but it doesn't surprise me because I know that things like that are happening. There have been some fast food companies that have started to say we're going to either phase out or stop buying containers and wrappers that have PFAS in it. But again, that's how we make things happen.
And that's going to be what you hear on period end of story. It's going to be a 29-minute show once a month focusing on just one topic, and we'll cover that topic for the entire show. The show is also going to be made available on Spreaker, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts, and there's already a new Facebook page for this show. Just go to facebook.com/PEOS Radio, and you can find the show right there. So I'm really excited about it. I've got a second episode in the works as well, where I'm going to be talking about art therapy and the fact that many states do not license art therapists, and that needs to change. Michigan is one of those states. And I'm going to fight like hell to get that done right here in the state of Michigan. I'm going to have a couple of guests joining me, somebody that you and I both know who is an art therapist and a damn good one.
Yeah.
So look forward to that show coming up in March. But again, my conversation with Tony Spagnola comes out February 15th. Check your local Pacifica station, also Spreaker, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Speaking of go ahead, Jack. I'm sorry.
To you, first of all, really, Darren, such a integral perspective that you're going to be offering. And this first topic is so important, and it's been kind of lulled to sleep, both with time and with the corporate drugging that wants to hide it. So great topic, and I really look forward to listening to that.
And since we're talking about PFAS, I want to go ahead and start out before we get into Trump and the truckers. This story came out on February 10th. This is Garrett Ellison writing for MLive.com. This is out of Oscoda, Michigan. Activists and experts are accusing U.S. defense officials of lying about whether veterans and their families drank toxic PFAS chemicals in the water at Wurtsmith Air Force Base before the installation closed in the early 1990s. In a public outreach document, the U.S. Department of Defense claims to be ignorant of data showing Wurtsmith veterans were highly exposed to the toxic chemicals, a claim one former Michigan regulator who studied the base extensively characterized as a blatant falsehood. In the document, which was released in January, defense officials wrote this, quote, "The Department of the Air Force is not aware of data which would support the assertion that veterans and their families at Wurtsmith were drinking water with very high levels of PFAS." End of quote. Bob Delaney, retired geologist who led the state's oversight at the former B-52 bomber base for years as site manager for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, responded to that report this way, quote, "That's a flat-out lie." End of quote.
Pretty succinct.
Yes, and when you do hear the first episode of Period End of Story, we actually talk a little bit about Bob Delaney and his work with the State Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or EGLE as it's called. He wrote a report, and the report was thrown in a drawer and not touched until the PFAS came out in Belmont, Michigan, which we talked about on this show a few years ago.
Yeah.
And that's
I have first-hand experience with the Oscoda sham. Lifelong friend, his dad built a cottage on the lake that's just adjacent to that Air Force Base, which, by the way, in the movie by Michael Moore, way back 20 years ago, that Air Force Base was highlighted. Michael has interviews underneath jet bomber, maintaining that Air Force Base supplied the largest percentage of bombs that went into Vietnam, and that was a staggering number anyway, leaving right there from Oscoda. Heavily used base. Anyway, my friend built this cottage. His dad built the cottage. He moved from Florida all the way up to be in it. And a matter of months there, the lake outside of his, now this isn't the Great Lakes, this is a lake, an inland lake, maybe a mile from Oscoda, had suds. They look like soap suds. And all of the cottagers and owners of property, they got a scientist somewhere to test it out, and it was the PFAS. It was that concentrated. And it's probably, I'm going to say, a quarter mile from the Air Force Base. And so the investigation and the work that the citizens there in Oscoda, trying to save their land property, was extensive, none of which ever made the news. No pictures have been seen. He sent me pictures. He has since sold that property and moved back to Florida. But that's a classic cover-up episode that took place there in Oscoda at one of the most active Air Force bases in North America, just quietly. Yes. And I believe that you probably remember the interview that Moore had. I think it's in Bowling for Columbine, but I'm not 100% sure. It's been some time.
Yeah. Let me continue the story real quickly here. In 2016, Delaney authored a report which found high PFAS levels in unflushed hydrants and old water appliances in abandoned buildings at the former base. In 2018, he followed that up with hydrogeological analysis, which concluded old groundwater wells that supplied base drinking water likely drew from an aquifer highly contaminated by toxic plumes. Delaney, former state coordinator for a defense site remediation grant program at Eagle, discovered PFAS at Wurtsmith in 2010 and tried for years to elevate widespread concern regarding the toxic chemicals within state government and U.S. defense remediation circles. He said both the 2016 and 2018 Eagle reports were sent to Air Force leaders and discussed with defense officials during regular remediation team meetings. The impetus for the reports was to create data that could support the development of a health study that would potentially help sickened Wurtsmith veterans receive disability and health benefits. No study has ever been launched. Now, this is the same type of health study that was done in Parkersburg, West Virginia, if you've seen the movie Dark Waters.
Yeah, sure have.
And it is amazing. As a matter of fact, earlier this week, Dark Waters was available for free streaming by invitation courtesy of the University of Michigan. I saw the movie, and Jack, you can't even imagine. I had tears welling up. I was so angry. And This movie just reminded me why I hate rich people, why I hate corporations, and why there needs to be heavy regulation on industry.
Yeah, we sit in a contaminated state here in the monikered pure Michigan, where corporations like cats messing in the basement floor have left their droppings all over the state, quietly. I'll never forget, I was a student in 1968 at Elma College, and next door to Elma is a town called St. Louis, and there's a chemical plant there adjoining the lake, and a circus came to town. And the circus was watering its elephant in the lake. We were sitting there, a bunch of us, and we could see the elephant. It took a big drink. It turned, walked maybe 50 feet, and dropped over dead quietly. And that was there for generations. How many cancers grew? That was in 68. That chemical plant has since closed down. But there was never any real mentioning. I real quickly talk about the tanning company that was on the bay in Montague for decades. The filth of toxic mud is so deep, it would take, they had an estimate, I don't know how many decades to ever even clean that bay close to safe levels. And that company just rolled along for decades. And I can go on to Muskegon, the smelting plant you're aware of. They're all over the state. But time and inattention has just dulled our view to it. Now we're suffering.
We certainly are. Let me continue here. Delaney said, quote, "Even if we had never produced any data, it's ridiculous. Anybody going to that base knowing the history of PFAS, knowing the groundwater flow, knowing how this stuff travels would know people were drinking this stuff. This is not rocket science. This is basic 101 environmental geology." End of quote.
Yep.
Nonetheless, the Department of Defense and the Air Force are doubling down on the claim, which was delivered as a formal response to a question from Delaney during an October meeting between PFAS activists around the country and defense officials such as Richard Kidd, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environment and Energy. In a lengthy statement to MLive, which sent copies of both the 2015 and 2018 Eagle reports to defense officials last month, Air Force Civil Engineering Center spokesperson Mark Kincaid pointed to passages within the Eagle reports which acknowledge inherent scientific uncertainty in the investigations because the former supply wells themselves could not be sampled, meaning the duration of veteran exposures could not be reliably determined. The base closed in 1993, and its redeveloped areas were hooked to municipal water drawn from Lake Huron in 1997, years before PFAS arose as a public health concern. Kincaid wrote, quote, "We recognize that PFAS was likely present in water supplies at Wurtsmith Air Force Base, but do not have data that support the assertion that veterans and their families at Wurtsmith were drinking water with very high levels of PFAS." End of quote. No, they know. They just don't want to admit to it.
Exactly.
Kincaid pointed to a 2019 review of the state's findings by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which highlighted uncertainties inherent to the fact that state regulators couldn't jump in a time machine. You don't need to jump in a time machine. All you got to do is look what it's doing now.
Hey, buddy, the time machine goes for thousands of years. That's PFAS time machine.
Yeah. Hot tub time machine full of PFAS, right?
Yeah.
Kincaid wrote, quote, because of the high degree of uncertainty associated with any Wurtsmith Air Force Base PFAS groundwater and drinking water modeling efforts, any assessment of exposure and resulting potential health impacts would be highly speculative and non-quantitative. ATSDR concluded there is not sufficient information available to determine when the on-base drinking water was impacted by PFAS or the level of PFAS in the on-base drinking water. End of quote. A Michigan PFAS activist and attorney who owns a home near the base called the Air Force position, quote, dancing on the head of a pin, end of quote, in response to a growing scandal. So they also talked to Tony Spagnola. Here's what he said, quote, this is a bureaucratic circle jerk going on here with no effort to try to solve this and try to get away with as little work as possible and cover up the fact that they have caused a big problem for a lot of people, end of quote. Spagnola said the Department of Defense has only itself to blame for a lack of exposure data, noting that the military holds stored blood samples taken from every service member both when they entered and when they left the service. Quote, how much study have they done? None. End of quote. During the 1980s, more than 3,000 military and civilian personnel were stationed annually at Wurtsmith. Numerous veterans and their family members have spoken out over the years regarding health problems they believe were connected to their time in Oscoda. The base water was also highly contaminated with trichloroethylene, cancer-causing solvent that was found at high levels in base wells. One veteran who was stationed there between 1989 and 1992 called the Air Force's position on PFAS exposure another slap in the face. James Mike Bussey of Pennsylvania, a former airman who leads a group called the Veterans and Civilians Clean Water Alliance, remembers crawling through PFAS-laden AFFF foam in Wurtsmith hangars, as well as drinking base water and eating lots of locally caught fish. Mm-hmm. In 2017, Bussey was evaluated at the War-Related Illness and Injury Study Center in New Jersey. His blood showed elevated PFAS levels, particularly for the compound PFHXS, which is commonly associated with toxic firefighting foam. Yeah, most of his disability benefit claims have been denied by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
Yep.
On a bigger scale, we know that the military is one of the global's biggest polluters.
Oh, yes.
In this country and around the world. There's a road in Iraq that won't be, this is exaggeration, it glows at night. There's so much hardware that we left, even nuclear hardware. That's right, nuclear hardware by this road that it's for centuries it will be polluted. And that's not atypical. We've dropped these poisonous bases and dumps. There's one in Indiana that had PFAS that's real quiet, down by Kokomo, just north of Kokomo. Again, there's no really responsible journalism that's tied this together. You mentioned that movie, and there was a documentary out even before that movie that I watched that did a great job. But the truth is, it's under the radar. It's absolutely underappreciated how bad it really is. And the cancers just keep rolling. They're harvested decades later. You sat in the gym with in where was that? Comstock High School?
Comstock Park High School, just outside of Grand Rapids. Where
testimony after testimony, people in this very hour were suffering from the impact and the ramifications of PFAS just north of Grand Rapids. And they said, trace it down. It goes to the DeFoss headquarters. It goes to 3M. It's easy to be seen, but it's protected by layers of attorneys. And meanwhile, we continue to die from its effects.
Yes.
Will it ever stop? Will it ever stop, Darren?
No.
If they really unplug, I mean, we're looking at not a glacier, but we're looking at an iceberg, just a tip. And they make damn sure you don't go down the side of the iceberg and see how bad it is. They just quietly assicate.
That's true. It really is. And when will it end? It will end when we break the grip that DuPont and 3M have on the legislature and have on every single aspect of government.
Every politician. Yep.
And not only that, when we kick out the corporate scientists and the corporate people out of the EPA, out of all the agencies that are supposed to protect us, but they're really not because they're run by the same insiders, that's when we'll get some satisfaction.
Yeah. In the meantime, it takes a John Brown type environmentalist, like what was the woman that we listened to there, Comstock? World famous.
Oh, Aaron Brockovich was there,
Aaron
the attorney.
Brockovich.
Yeah.
It takes somebody to have their life threatened, to go into an area and stir things up and fight. And, she was an attractive woman and a very effective speaker, and she made a dent in it. But we're not getting that kind of in-depth fight against these corporate poisoners. It's just not there.
And the same thing with the attorney in Cincinnati that exposed DuPont in Parkersburg, West Virginia. His life was threatened too.
Sure was.
Let me continue.
I know about DuPont. My ex-wife's father had something like 15 patents out of DuPont. They lived in Delaware.
Wow.
DuPont was just over... And do I dare remind our listeners of the Academy Award-winning portrayal of the heir to DuPont, who started a wrestling team for the Olympics and murdered a couple of people, and his jealousy, he wasn't getting enough acclaim. The movie, I can't think of the name of it.
And I can't think of the name of it either.
Yeah, but the depth of corruption there goes so far deep that it even surpasses the chemical poisoning. You said these billionaires that have these corporate monolith behemoths thrive in corruption, and they know they're protected.
They certainly do. Let me continue here. Bussey said, quote, Wurtsmith veterans suffer from a myriad of health problems in percentages well above the national norm. To have the Department of the Air Force perpetuate this lie is unacceptable. How many of us have to die by Air Force negligence before something is done? End of quote. Well, the answer to that is take a look at COVID. We got 900,000 dead already, right?
Yeah.
Delaney, who has become active with nonprofits pushing for stronger PFAS regulations following his retirement, criticized the ATSDR review, saying it contains glaring mistakes in technical understanding of the Eagle reports. He thinks they were not read carefully. They probably weren't read at all, in my opinion. His investigation obtained water samples from 22 abandoned hydrants that were never flushed when municipal water came to the base, plus a water softener tank and a water heater that were left in abandoned buildings. One hydrant tested at 7,400 parts per trillion for the individual compounds PFOS and PFOA, which is far above any credible safety exposure thresholds. Another hydrant tested at 4,380 parts per trillion. The water heater sample tested at 960 parts per trillion. In the hydrants, the water sat untouched for years in the underground catch basins that were well above the water table and outside the pipes that connected to the mains. The long chemical chains in PFAS molecules guard against their dissipation through evaporation. There is no other explanation for high PFAS levels in the hydrants beyond the fact that the base water was highly contaminated, according to Delaney. Groundwater could not have reached the catch basins, and had the hydrants been flushed, they would have been clean. Where else did it come from? Delaney said, quote, how did the high levels of PFAS get in the hydrants and tanks if it wasn't before 1997 when the water came from on-base wells? End of quote. In a statement this week, U.S. Representative Dan Kildee, Democrat from Flint who represents Oscoda, said, quote, it is shameful that the Department of Defense continues to obscure the facts to avoid taking responsibility for what they've done in Oscoda. End of quote. Kildee has continually reintroduced a bill called the Vets PFAS Act since 2018, but the legislation has failed to gain traction. He plans to try again this year. The legislation would require the Veterans Administration to cover treatment for any health condition found to be associated with exposure to PFAS. Under the bill, illnesses connected to PFAS exposure would also be considered a service-connected disability, making veterans exposed to PFAS eligible for disability payments and medical treatment from the VA. Spagnola said, quote, "The people who have gotten screwed in this the worst are the veterans. They just been swept under the rug. It's really a sad state of affairs." End of quote.
Mm-hmm.
He's right. He is absolutely right.
Yep.
It is just scary.
You know, isn't it incredible that the history now of Michigan is just laced with chemical spills and poisonous rivers and, you know, massive. I go back to the 70s with the cancer agent, can't remember the chemical compound, and the dust retardant.
Oh, wait, are you talking about the PBB scandal?
Yeah.
Yep,
I
that
sure
was
am.
actually fire retardant.
There you go. Yeah,
because the same company that produced the fire retardant also produced nutrients for cattle, and the bags were so similar that you couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, that's 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And that was a shockingly large scale. Every woman that was in Michigan had it in her breast milk.
Yeah.
Still do.
Yes. A friend of mine who listens to this show in Oklahoma, his wife, I went to high school with both of them. She's part of the PBB study, has been for decades.
Yeah. And then for a long time, you go to Myers. This would have even preceded the 70s scandal when three courageous journalists that worked for Fox, of all places. I used to show this documentary to my classes. Mm-hmm. Discovered that the milk enhancer that was injected into cows that tripled their udder production was highly, highly cancerous. They made a documentary that would reveal this danger, and a conservative judge said no corporations have the legal right to lie and to cover the truth. I'm not making it up. These three journalists lost their jobs. But this goes back 60 years now, Darren.
It's just scary how much influence corporations have. Way too much influence on everything.
Yeah, and people would buy milk for decades at Myers that had a little sign on it that said, free of, and then it had the chemical.
Are you talking about the growth hormone, RBST?
I sure am.
There's still some milk that's being produced that says free of RBST.
Yeah, but who the hell knows what it is? They don't know the history of it. I know for a fact because I sat on breakfast tables. And my grandkids would, what is that? Free from that, what is that? People have no idea what it was.
No.
They have no idea how ubiquitous it was.
No, they don't. They don't know how ubiquitous the PFAS is, or that PFAS is not just one chemical. It's a family of them.
And we don't have chemical statistics that say X amount of cancers resulted from that growth hormone that we couldn't even get out. We can go back before that to the asbestos scandal and the lead minings out in Montana.
Yeah. It
is a legacy. If racism is our history, according to the experts behind the new educational CRT, that's the moniker. Our history is racism. We were founded on racism. Our country was worked by racist people that made billions of dollars. Our country is founded on racism. That's the truth. That's the historical truth. Well, if you want to take it a step farther, the chemical poisoning of the world, you remember the professor up at Ferris that they said was crazy?
Yeah, we just talked about
that. We started in the 15th century poisoning the world with tobacco. How many cancers?
Yeah.
Could somebody estimate? He just made a guess. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of people have died from America's use of tobacco that we imported around the world.
Oh, I know. You know, Jack, this is why I am a big proponent of, what do I always say on Facebook? Eat the rich. Like you said, don't worry about taxing the rich. Worry about eating the rich.
Exactly. And your first plateful of rich can be the family that was behind the OxyContin epidemic.
Absolutely.
That hid the fact, scientific, paid scientists off to hide the fact that this was highly, highly addictive.
Well,
that's a recent documentary. I saw that about a month ago.
Well, Tony brings up in the first episode of Period End of Story that PFAS was discovered during the Manhattan Project. And even back then, the scientists said, hey, you don't need to be using this stuff. This is bad stuff. Do not use it in any household stuff. Instead, DuPont says, oh, no, we've heard from the housewives across America, and they're sick of food sticking to the pan, so we're going to coat pans with this miracle product called Teflon.
Yeah.
Not telling anybody what they knew, that Teflon was so poisonous that at one point they pulled women off of the Teflon line because they were having birth defects.
Sure. Yeah, and my ex-father-in-law invented it. He worked for DuPont. That was their goal, to make that stickless, that cover.
Yeah.
He lost his mind. He became like a vegetable, just breathing the toxins of it.
Oh, geez, that's terrible. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back. Our history is a history of chemical pollution and cover-up.
Yeah, it is. Well, we should probably move on to our next topic here before I get really mad. Let's talk about these protesters in Canada, these truckers, which only account for about, 10% of the truckers in Canada? At least
that's very small.
Yeah. So they've driven to Ottawa in Canada, where the capital is. They're raising hell there. They're over in Windsor, blocking access to the Ambassador Bridge to traffic coming from the United States into Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So now all of the truckers that are trying to get stuff into Canada have to drive north to Port Huron, and they're so backed up, they're sitting in traffic 4 or 5 hours waiting to cross the bridge in Port Huron to go into Sarnia.
Yeah.
Well,
And there's 2 or 3 other border places out west, in Montana and so forth, going into the United States. But the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit is the largest industrial crossway, goods crossway in North America, by the way.
Yes, indeed. And actually, I have this story here. I want to get to this. This is Frank Witzel, writing for the Detroit Free Press. This is dated February 10th. The trucker protest that closed traffic on the Ambassador Bridge entered its 4th day early Thursday, with increasing disruptions to the auto industry and calls from officials to end it. There's no indication when the standoff will end or what exactly truckers are seeking. But Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkins signaled Thursday that he was preparing to use police reinforcements to physically remove the protesters soon if they did not disperse on their own. In an interview with CNN, he said, quote, "It's very frustrating because people just want us to go in and flush everyone out, and there's a real threat of violence here," end of quote. He suggested that some of the protesters have said that they are willing to die for their cause. Well, my thoughts, let them.
Yeah.
Let them. You want to be that dumb and deny science, deny masks and vaccines work? Hey, I'm like Howard Stern. I'm sick of these people. I'm done with them. You want to be dumb, take yourself out. I don't care. The problem is you idiots are exposing other people who are immunocompromised to your germs, and you could kill those people because you're selfish. That's what it is.
These are guys driving trucks, across the border all over the United States. How long have they been doing it? First of all, the whole bombast about, hey, we'll die for, I put them to the test on that. Okay.
Yeah. And by the way, let me add this. This isn't like the coal miner protest in the 19-teens. This isn't the steel workers against Andrew Carnegie in the 1880s. No, this is different, folks.
Yeah, and I did not hear law enforcement worried about violence when they cracked skulls in the streets in Flint for the protesters there fighting for pregnancy leave. I didn't hear anybody say, we just, these guys, these auto workers are tough guys. We're not going to interfere in any way.
Yeah.
No, they lined up in mass. They did the same out west to the strikes out there in the mines.
Yeah.
They weren't worried about violence then.
Absolutely.
And it's not that violent. It's not that violent when you go in armed with wreckers and start pulling trucks off. We're not talking about bombing. This is not a large-scale blockade. It's a 2-lane highway. There's some of the protests that have actually happened in United States history that took up acres, armed lines of men. This is not that difficult. I heard an expert yesterday say this could be done in a matter of hours.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll see if Trudeau continues to pussyfoot around. Whitmer has called on the Canadian government to break up this blockade. It's costing millions of dollars, and workers, their livelihoods, as a danger factor, needs to be undone.
Yeah, let me continue the story here. Windsor Mayor Dilkins added, quote, "We have called in and requested additional police support from the Ontario Provincial Police. They are starting to arrive now," end of quote. He added that if the protesters, quote, "don't leave, there will have to be a path forward," end of quote. The Canadian Trucking Alliance said Thursday that the protests are not peaceful and many of the vehicles and people involved in the protests are not heavy trucks or people involved in the trucking industry. So it's the Canadian version of maggots.
Yep.
Of cuckoos, as I like to call them.
Yep, that's who they are.
Yep.
And it doesn't take that many. A very small percentage. 80% of Canadians have all been vaccinated.
Yeah. At around 6:30 a.m. Thursday, Michigan State Police sent out a tweet that said, "Avoid the area around the Ambassador Bridge if you can. There are going to be backups in the area." Windsor Police also sent out a tweet that said, "Although the Ambassador Bridge is not closed U.S.-bound, the presence of demonstrators are making it difficult to access the bridge. We urge all motorists to avoid both access points to the bridge." The protest, however, is more than a traffic issue. It is now a serious commerce and political concern that has forced automakers to cancel shifts and even close plants, and inspiring similar protests as far away as Paris and potentially Washington, D.C. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer called on Canada to take, quote, "all necessary and appropriate steps to immediately and safely reopen traffic so we can continue growing our economy, supporting good-paying jobs, and lowering costs for families. Our communities and automotive, manufacturing, and agriculture businesses are feeling the effects. It's hitting paychecks and production lines. That is unacceptable," end of quote.
Yeah.
U.S. Rep. Debbie Dingell, Democrat of Dearborn, echoed the governor by saying, quote, "We need to reopen the bridge now. It's as simple as that," end of quote. She said she supports the right to protest, but, quote, "we can do so without impacting our economy and our workers in Michigan and beyond," end of quote. She urged Canadian authorities to, quote, "get this bridge back up and running immediately," end of quote.
Yep.
Stephen Laskowski, president of the Canadian Trucking Alliance, said, quote, "the patience of drivers and the vast majority of the trucking industry regarding these blockades has long since expired," end of quote. He added, quote, "the trucking industry and its drivers are paying a heavy price," end of quote. He added that the protesters' actions, quote, "simply hurt Canadians and show a blatant disregard for all the lives they are impacting," end of quote.
Yeah.
The situation in Canada has grown so bad, Windsor Police asked residents early Thursday, and after hundreds of phone calls, to stop phoning police to get updates about the bridge closure. What began late last month as long-haul truck driver demonstrations in Ottawa, which is Canada's capital, to protest vaccine-related border mandates imposed by the Canadian government, has turned into an international affair with shutdowns of major gateways in Detroit and Port Huron between the U.S. and Canada. In Detroit, traffic from Canada is open, but going into Canada over the bridge is a problem, especially for commercial traffic, which has been rerouted to the Blue Water Bridge in Port Huron, about an hour away, which has also become congested.
That's always congested anyway. I've traveled across there many times. It's always a line there for hours sometimes.
Yeah, I have too. Travelers and international commuters can still drive through the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel. News photos show them picketing in front of parked tractor trailers and cars. There are Canadian flags and multiple handwritten signs in English and French. One sign read, "Mandate freedom," mocking the government's pandemic restrictions. Others say, "Freedom pour nos enfants." "Thank you, Ottawa truckers. Courage is contagious," and "Trudeau for treason."
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, like you call them, wingnuts.
Hey, listen,
nut jobs.
Don't think the Canadian authorities and police force can't break this up. You know, I've heard people say, it's like England, you know, all those bobbies, they don't even have a gun. And when they, like the comedian said once, when they holler at the burglars, they say, "stop." In America, they say, "stop," or "we'll shoot." In England, they say, "stop," or else they stop again. So, all kidding aside, I've seen the Canadian military and police force break up riots in Toronto, G20. about 15 years ago. There were thousands of protesters, and Antifa came in from Quebec. And I don't mean 10, I mean hundreds of Antifa. Black bloc with 200 people in each block marching down the street in Toronto. The police presence, the force was swift, brutal, helicopters, and broke up the not only the Antifa, the whole protest of thousands of protesters in the streets. They were there to protest G20. So they're operative. They're not bobbies. They're capable of breaking this up in a matter of hours. This whole thing about being afraid of violence is ridiculous. If it gets to the Super Bowl in L.A., which they're threatening, I'm sure you've heard of that threat.
Yep.
I expect there to be swift retaliation because there's millions of dollars riding on of a good performance.
Billions.
Billions, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that'll get broken up real quick because nobody messes with Super Bowl.
Exactly. The right-wing media here has lied about the extent and the amount of people that are involved in this. It's a small contingent of right-wing yo-yos that are pulling this off. Wing nuts, whatever you want to say. It's not reflective of the American or the Canadian public. Not at all.
Evil, violent, conservative savages. Let's just continue to call them what they actually are.
Yeah.
And since we're talking about evil, violent, conservative savages, let's go to the head of the pack, Mr. Trump himself, although I use the term Mr. very loosely. I have this story. This is Saraski Rai writing for The Hill. This is dated February 7th. The National Archives and Records Administration retrieved multiple White House record boxes last month that were improperly kept at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago property. That is according to a report published by the Washington Post. According to the Post, the boxes reportedly contained important records of communication, gifts, and letters from world leaders, which is a violation of the Presidential Records Act. By the way, Trump can go to prison for 3 years just on that. But he won't, because nobody has any guts anymore. The newspaper added that the boxes retrieved from the Florida estate included correspondence with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, as well as a letter from former President Obama to Trump. The Washington Post noted that recent administrations have all had some Presidential Records Act violations, including the use of unofficial email and telephone accounts, as well as the destruction of emails. But a source told the newspaper that the transfer to Mar-a-Lago was, quote, out of the ordinary. NARA has never had that kind of volume transfer after the fact like this, end of quote. The Hill has reached out to the National Archives and Trump's office for comment. The Presidential Records Act, which was put in place following the Watergate scandal, requires administrations to document and maintain records of the White House decision-making process. The new development comes just a week after NARA handed over some Trump White House documents to the House Select Committee investigating the January 6, 2021 traitorous insurrection that were reportedly torn up and taped back together. I added traitorous because that's what they were. They are traitors.
Yep.
The National Archives said last week that the documents, quote, included paper records that had been torn up by Trump, end of quote. Trump had sued to stop the committee from being given certain documents, with his attorney claiming it was illegal and that Trump wanted to preserve privileges over certain documents. But that's not where the story ends, Jack. You told me about this, and I about fell over when you said flushing documents. I'm like, what the hell is Jack talking about? Because I hadn't seen the CNN interview. Yeah, we literally mean the flushing of documents. I have this. This is Mike Allen writing for Axios.com. This is dated February the 10th. While Donald Trump was in office, staff in the White House residence periodically discovered wads of printed paper clogging a toilet and believed that Trump had flushed pieces of paper. That is according to excerpts from Maggie Haberman's new book, Confidence Man.
Right. Doesn't it make sense that the Trump library then will be the septic tank there at the White House?
Oh.
Save a lot of money. Well, I just think it's amazing that his legacy really is centered around the crapper, the seat of a toilet.
Oh, God. Oh, boy. The revelation by Haberman, whose coverage as a New York Times White House correspondent was followed obsessively by Trump, adds a vivid new dimension to his lapses in preserving government documents. Axios was provided an exclusive first look at some of her reporting. Trump has told people that since leaving office, he has remained in contact with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, whose love letters, as Trump once called them, were among documents that the National Archives retrieved from Mar-a-Lago. The news of White House toilet flushing comes as the National Archives has reportedly asked the Biden Justice Department to examine Trump's handling of White House records amid the congressional investigation into the January 6th violent, traitorous insurrection assault on the Capitol. I added violent, traitorous because that's what they are. The Washington Post reports that the National Archives officials, quote, suspected Trump had possibly violated laws concerning the handling of government documents, end of quote. The National Archives later retrieved 15 boxes from Mar-a-Lago. Archives officials found possible classified material in the returned boxes. That's according to a report published by the New York Times. While in office, Trump blithely flouted the Presidential Records Act, which required him to preserve written communications concerning his official duties. Trump routinely tore up documents and after leaving office brought substantial written materials back to Mar-a-Lago. A Trump spokesman did not immediately respond to a request for comment about the plumbing matter, but we'll get to that because there's a little more to that as well. Haberman's book, Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America, will be published October 4th by Penguin Press. The publisher says it traces Trump's early life in New York and, quote, his decades of interactions with prosecutors, end of quote, then follows him through 4 years in the White House and on to his post-presidential life in Palm Beach. This is the book Trump fears most. Among Trump aides, Haberman's book has been the most discussed of the bookshelf of books from reporters who covered Trump's campaigns and White House. Several advisors were unhappy about his decision to talk to her as part of his marathon conversations with book authors at Mar-a-Lago, but they concluded he couldn't help himself and couldn't be stopped. Haberman, a lifelong New Yorker, has covered Trump extensively since 2011 when she was a reporter at Politico. Earlier, she got to know his Manhattan milieu as a reporter for the New York Post and Daily News. Haberman, who is represented by Matt Latimer and Keith Urban at Javelin, was part of a Times team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018. By the way, Trump did respond to this, and we have this. This is from Oriana Gonzalez at Axios. Donald Trump said Thursday that he was, quote, under no obligation, end of quote, to return White House records to the National Archives and Records Administration at the end of his presidential term. Trump also denied that he destroyed or flushed papers and documents down a White House toilet. Of course he would. But I think he said fake news. Oh, yeah. Brother.
Yeah.
Let's see. Reports show that during his presidency, Trump was known to destroy or restrict access to official presidential records. While Trump was in office, staff in the White House residents periodically discovered wads of printed paper clogging a toilet. Again, that's according to Confidence Man. Trump said, quote, the papers were given easily and without conflict and on a very friendly basis. In fact, it was viewed as routine and no big deal. In actuality, I have been told I was under no obligation to give this material based on various legal rulings that have been made over the years. End of quote. Trump did not specify which rulings allow him to do so. In response to the flushing of documents, he responded, quote, also, another fake story that I flushed papers and documents down a White House toilet is categorically untrue and simply made up by a reporter in order to get publicity for a mostly fictitious book, end of quote. He said that some of the information given to NARA would, quote, someday be displayed in the Donald J. Trump Presidential Library, or, Jack, as you call it, the septic tank at the White House. By the way, the truth is, under the Presidential Records Act, a president is required to immediately turn in presidential records to the National Archivist as soon as they leave office. The House Oversight Committee said Thursday, quote, removing or concealing government records is a criminal offense punishable by up to 3 years in prison, end of quote. Trump, well, I didn't have to turn any of those records back.
Yeah, I could see some great advertising possibilities for Roto-Rooter or for Drano, Think of it.
Drano, the official drain cleaner at Mar-A-Lago, endorsed by Donald Trump himself.
Yeah, right.
Or what's that stuff you pour down your toilet? Rid-X. There you go.
There you go. Oh, yeah. Hey, you got some nasty family secrets you tried to flush down? Get Drano. Get
Rid-X. Oh, good Lord. On that same topic, Oriana Gonzalez had another article for Axios that was published on February 10th. The White House panel probing the January 6th insurrection has found gaps in White House phone logs from the day of the attack, with investigators finding few records of calls that Donald Trump made which are known to the committee. Again, that is according to a report published by the New York Times. There is no evidence that the logs were altered per the Times, and Trump is known to have routinely used his personal cell phone. But the lack of information has made it more difficult to piece together what Trump was doing during the riot. Well, we know what he was doing because we have witnesses. He was rewinding it and watching it and gleefully just applauding them. A spokesperson for the January 6th committee declined to comment. The panel learned recently that Trump spoke to former Vice President Mike Pence and GOP lawmakers the morning of the riot as part of his efforts to overturn the election. Again, that is according to the New York Times. Such calls did not show up in the call logs. So this is real interesting stuff here. He's covering up, flushing documents. He's not really that bright of a guy because the White House has, 26 fireplaces in it? And he didn't think of burning the documents? Not that I'm condoning that, but Jesus.
The report that I heard, or one of the reports I heard, it could have been on NPR, is that this is because of his history of flushing stuff down the toilet. It was just a natural reaction. He'd been doing it for years, and he may have lived in domiciles that didn't have fireplaces. So whatever Donnie did not like, his little hands threw it in the toilet and flushed it away. He was just doing what he had done for decades prior to the White House. And that's not exaggeration. That's what they theorized. Because any understanding of plumbing, anybody would realize the quantity of stuff he had to be flushing down there. It's not, it's going to clog up. You can't put a single tampon down, right? I mean, it's silly that he'd ever thought it wouldn't be noticed.
Like you said, he's lived in apartments all his life. How many of those apartments actually had fireplaces? Probably none.
Yeah.
So
you just flush it away.
Yeah.
Which is indicative of his whole life. Not just physically flushing the toilet down, but anything odious, anything that disagreed with his objectives, you just flush it away. Yep. You don't deal with it. You don't answer it. You don't change.
Exactly. Did you hear the story, Omarosa, who was on The Apprentice and then was one of his aides? She said that she saw him actually take a note and wad it up, stick it in his mouth, chew it, and swallow it. This is a guy that's reportedly one of the biggest germaphobes around.
Wow.
That's what I say.
That is incredible, but nothing, real briefly, associated with Trump, do we see a little splintering? McConnell this week came out pretty sternly against the insurrection, and I don't know. I think there's people trying to resurrect the Republican Party into, a moderately corrupt corporate party instead of a bunch of gangsters, which is what it is now. I don't know. It's slow, but, there's some pretty powerful players. I think Liz Cheney's a tough woman, and she's led the way, and now she's getting some support. We can only hope.
The Republican National Committee earlier this week said that the January 6th violent insurrection, the traitorous insurrection, was First Amendment. It was a peaceful protest. No, it wasn't.
Usual political discourse, I think they said.
Yeah, and Mitch McConnell, of all people, came out and said, no, it was violence.
Yeah.
I saw a tweet earlier this week. Adam Kinzinger was called out because a report came out that he had taken a gun with him to the Capitol on January 6th. And he said, yeah, I did, because I knew there was going to be violence in the streets. And I was right. He was looking out for his own self, you know? Wow.
Yeah, you don't need to be an intelligence expert. You just have a computer. You could see it was coming. But the contingent of people who are standing against Trump is that, you know, we have his hardcore idiots that support him regardless, absolutely, regardless of the corruption that's uncovered daily. And, you know, those guys are strictly in it for their political gain. And his base are too stupid to understand news, valid news. So I don't see it being anything but a fringe movement. And I think as the months go by, this nightmare is going to reemerge. We're at 7.5 on the inflation rate. Mm-hmm. The reason for that is just greed. You wonder if the corporations aren't saying, hey, let's sink Biden's chance. Every major one concern of voters today is the economy. Yeah. And the economy be reversed at this point would take the cooperation of the corporations and say, the hell with it. Well, we can get Trump back by making money. We can resurrect Trump by making outrageous profit. That's a win-win for those assholes.
Yeah, exactly. Let me ask you this question before we head out of here. Do you see the splintering continue if Trump decides he's going to run in 2024?
Well, there's some strong people in second place, like the Satan down in Florida. That guy is pretty shrewd.
Death sentence.
Yeah, death sentence. So, you know, and they can rally some muscles. Some people may realize, hey, there's crazy baggage with Trump and the investigation into the January 6th. That'll be coming out, and that's not going to be helpful. So it's all together. But, hey, it's replacing a turd with diarrhea. I mean, it's not it's not like we're going to have an honorable Republican step in. And I'm assuming that whoever gets in, if they beat Trump for that nomination, will go right after the Trumpers with the same agenda that Trump had. Why wouldn't they?
There hasn't been an honorable Republican since probably Dwight Eisenhower, and my mom would disagree with that. My mother hated Ike, hated his guts, still does.
Right. Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
See, the Republicans know there hasn't been a presidential candidate, Democratic presidential candidate, that gathered a majority of white votes since Lyndon Baines Johnson. You can check me on that. That's the last time a Democratic nominee for president of the United States got a majority of white votes. And so thus you have all these state defense systems to stop the black vote. The future doesn't bode well for democracy.
Yeah.
They know they've got to stop the black vote. They saw what happened in Georgia. So in Texas now, each county has one ballot place. And some of them have hundreds of thousands of people, and you know it's tailor made to make sure the white vote wins. And if it doesn't win, then they have their legislatures that will just declare it invalid and name their own candidate. We're looking at the ravages of democracy today, and we talk about this every time. But there's maybe nothing more worrisome when you talk about the future of this country.
Yeah. Oh, boy. Well, Jack, we got to get going. We are out of time for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson.
I'm Jack Prince.
For Katy Steele, please support independent media and the First Amendment.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.